Welcome back to part 2 of the project tutorial. So in part 1, we started by reading the project description to sketch out kind of a general structure of the program. Right, and this structure starts from thinking about the entities, the classes we care about, thinking about their data component, what kind of data is stored inside these classes, and also thinking about the actions, the behavior implemented in methods. So in this part, in part 2, um, we're going to start kind of sketching out an implementation in Java. So again, back to that analogy of building a house, we want to start by building the house from um, um, the high level details, right? The frame, the floors, the roofs, and finishing out the details like the room interior furniture at the end, not vice versa, because otherwise it becomes very hard to think about the parts without having a good picture about the whole. So the plan is basically to use this sketch as a guide when we're creating these classes and when we're implementing them in Java. So I'm going to go to Eclipse and create a brand new project. Call it project tutorial. Okay. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to create a class for each one of these entities that we thought about. So we've got game, player, ship, board, and cell. So I'm going to create a class basically for game, a class for player, a class for ship, a class for board, a class for cell. I'm not so sure about the value of cell yet, but um, I'm going to create it anyhow. So I've got 5 classes. I think that was about it. 3, 4, 5. And let's think about kind of mapping out what we sketch into the classes here. So let's think about game. We said that game has 2 players, player 1 and player 2, and a couple of methods to kind of guide the players playing the game. So let's start with the data part. Game has 2 players, so those will become attributes. So I'm going to create an attribute of type player. I'm going to call it player 1. Another attribute, call it player 2. Okay, so I'm going to create each one on a separate statement for a reason that will become clear shortly. So that's the game. It has 2 players. And of course, there are some details that will come to life later on, right? So, uh, like whether we need extra attributes to store the state of the game, the fact that the game is ongoing or it has ended with a winning situation or a drawing situation, and so on and so forth. So that's that for game. Let's move on to the second one, which is player. It seems that we've got a type and a couple of other things we worry about. So I'm going to create an attribute for type. And since the type is either human or a computer in this case, I'm going to create a boolean. And following the naming convention of Java, I'm going to call it isHuman. All right, so if it's not human, it's a computer in this case. And then we've got a bunch of ships. So a collection of ships. I'm going to use arrays. Private ship ships. And then it has 2 boards actually. So each player has 2 boards, its own board and the enemy's board. So I'm going to create another attribute. Let's call it onBoard. And of course, it has to be of type board because it's a board. And do the same for the enemy's board. Okay, So again, if you think about the physical implementation of the game, scroll down, go back to that picture, like these two players playing the game, we are creating virtual objects to recreate the game. We need two players objects. Each one has two boards, right? So instead of being physical, real human being and physical boards, those are all virtual objects. But the idea is that we are trying to model uh, this game in our code. Okay, so we've got two boards, and each board has multiple cells, and each layer has multiple ships, right? And there is a game here. Okay, so let's go back here. So we've got two players on board, enemy's board, and well, I'm not so sure about the ship yet because the ship has a position, so presumably it has like maybe an X and Y. It has a rotation, which I'm not sure what that rotation is because you can rotate it. Some of these can rotate multiple times, right? If you take a look at some of those shapes, some of them can only rotate in two positions like I, but J has four candidate positions. You can rotate it 3 times to get 4 different shapes. Some of them like O has only one shape. Even if you rotate it, it remains the same, right? So it depends on the actual piece, right? So I'm not sure how to store shape and how to store this rotation information. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave it for now, and I'm going to leave a comment that, if you need to figure out shape and position, and I left it as a comment, and what I did, I added to do to that comment. So when you add to do to a comment, most IDEs, including Eclipse, will provide this to do on a separate to-do list that you can check. So you open your project and you can go to your task list, to your to-do list, and if you double on your to-do list, it will take you to that to-do item. So this is neat because you need to figure out the details, but you can't create a step at this point. You add it as a to-do item that you can revisit in the future. And then I'm going to move on to board in this case. Well, so board has an array of cells, and if I go here, I can create a 2-dimensional array of cells. And again, I'm not so sure what I'm storing inside the cell. It seems that I'm going to store a character, very much like what we did with a tic-tac-toe game. So I can create a 2-dimensional array of cells, call it cells. But for the time being, I can create it to be a 2-dimensional array of characters because characters will go inside it. So I'm still not sure here. So let me put another to-do item, figure out whether we need a class for cell. Okay, so right now I've got 2 items on my to-do list for the future. Okay, so this is in terms of mapping out the data components in each one. Now, the difficult part is that you want to start somewhere and you want to start and test your code to ensure that, well, so the game is kind of the logic of the game is being followed, of course, without finishing out the details, but you want to start somewhere. So in this case, it makes sense basically to look at where you have some methods already figured out, right? And to start with these methods. So in this case, we figure out that there is one method called shoot in the player class, and there are also a couple of methods we've got here in game, right? Asking players to alternate, enter name, and so on. So it doesn't make a big difference, but we can start either in game or in player, right? So let's start in game. And well, actually in game, it's very similar to what we did in the tic-tac-toe example. The two players are taking turns in alternating, right? So if you remember, that class had a main method, and the main method did the job of receiving kind of input from the user and also prompting, kind of displaying the results in the output and so on. So we can follow the same guide, the same kind of overall design, and place our main method, our main entry inside the game here. So I'm going to create a main method, and of course, if you created this class knowing that you have a main method, you could have checked that to get the main method implemented for you. And this is where the game starts, right? So you can just run to see that this is working fine. The code compiles, there are no compile time error and so on. So that's working fine. So, but let's think about kind of going through the game. So what's going on, and this becomes also clear if you revisit that example here, is that in the beginning, there is this phase where you're prompting for some kind of input, such as the player's name and the location of pieces on the board. And then there is the main game after you place all of the positions, the ships. There is the main game loop, which is basically when the two players are taking turns. So there is two phases basically here. There is setting up, main loop, and probably there's the third phase, which is reporting results maybe. All right, so there are three basic things. Setting up, which is prompting for some input, the main loop, players taking turn, and finally reporting the results, right? So now thinking about the details, you will just realize that there are more things we care about here, right? But let's think about the main loop. Also, the main loop is basically a loop where two players alternate in taking turns, right? Okay, so we have a loop. Let's say we have a loop here, and inside this loop, two players will alternate. So the question is, alternate in doing what, right? If you read the description, it's basically saying that they will alternate shooting on each other's fleet, right? So that's the taking turn part, right? So if you think about this, this is basically player 1 shooting, and then player 2 shooting. Okay, that's the method shoot, right? So then if this is the case, we need to go ahead and implement the method 2 in player because it does not exist yet. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go to the method player, the class player, and implement a method. For now, I don't know if I have a return type, but it seems I need a method at least, shoot. And what I'm going to do to kind of shooting on the other player. So of course, it shouldn't print line, it should do something else, but I just want to provide a kind of a working implementation to finish in the future. So if you go back to game here, you got player 1.shoot and player 2.shoot. Well, it seems there is another problem here, which is basically the fact that you need to create, you can't access those attributes in the main method. You need to create an instance of game. So game is equal to new game. So again, this is the fact that the two players are an attribute to two attributes of the class. So you need to create an instance of the class in order to access them. So game player 1 and game dot player 2, and of course it's inside the class. Even though they're private, they're accessible, right? So because we are inside game, we can access those attributes. So the final detail is basically the fact that those are also objects and they need to be created. If you don't create them, you will get a null pointer exception because they are initially null. So you need to create also the objects here. And this is an infinite loop. Well, the game starts and the two players will kind of take turn and alternating. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to break because I don't want to get inside an infinite loop. So you get that the game starts and player 1 is shooting on the other player and player 2 is shooting on the other player, right? All right, so that's a good start, right? Now, if you take a look at the implementation here, you just realize that these two players each one has a name, right? And this is used to address them during the game and also report the result. So this is an extra piece of information that we haven't thought about when we kind of came up with this sketch. It seems that a player has a name, right? And that name is prompted for in the input stage. So let's make that happen. I'm going to go to my player and say, well, this player now has a name. And since I want to expose name to the outside, I'm going to create a setter and a getter method. So public void set name string name, and I will do this dot name will be name, right? Because I'm setting name, and then I'm doing public string get name, and this is the getter method that will return name. So I want to do this because I want to expose name to the method in game, and I want to set up the game by asking the player to enter their name. So I'm going to do system out print. Just copy pasted this, and now I want to prompt for input. So again, to prompt for input, we need the scanner. So I'm going to import the scanner from util, and I'm going to create a scanner here. Okay. Now I'm going through the details in game and player because I want it to be roughly working before proceeding through. So I want to have something working up in setting up the game. Of course, it's not finished, but kind of I'm trying to flesh out more details in this part, at least the setting up stage and the main loop. Okay, so I'm going to ask enter your name, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to read that. So I'm going to do scanner next line, and of course if you read this details, it's also asking you to name your opponent because your opponent is a machine. So give a name to your computer opponent. So same story, system out print and string name 2 will be scanner next line as well. So done with this stage, what I'm going to do now, those are two local variables here. I want to pass those to player 1 and player 2, right? Because this information belongs to those two objects. So I'm going to set name. So of course it's game.player1.set name, a name 1, and game player 2 set name 2. All right. So this information is now passed to player to be stored in here, and I'm going to test that it's passed correctly by saying that name is shooting on the other player. Okay. So now if I go back to game, and the game starts, it's now asking me for my name. Let's give a name to the opponent here. And you can see that the main loop is alternating between the two players shooting on each other. Right? Of course, if you take out this break, it's going to be the infinite loop. Right? They will take turns forever. But that's kind of the basic structure of the game, right? You prompt for input, you go inside the main loop, and then you need to figure out how to break from this loop to report the results. So I'm going to stop at this point in this part, and we'll continue in part 3.